So I want to welcome John. Thank you for coming, and John FUTINI.
Well, it looks like a nice full audience. As Mr. Wilder mentioned, 2013 is the 150th anniversary of the Civil War's hinge of fate. In 1863, 150 years ago, America was torn apart and in the middle of a vast civil war, which it might or might not survive. No one could tell at that point. It looked as if, oh, and one little anecdote, we're at February the 3rd today. We're 5 months removed from the 3rd day of the 150th anniversary of the Battle of Gettysburg. But at any rate, in 1863, the pivotal year of the American Civil War, it was uncertain as to what the outcome might be. It looked as if the northern side was prevailing. It had superior numbers. It had factories. It had materiel. It also had Lincoln's sword. Lincoln's sword was his writing and his speeches. And in terms of his writing, on January the 1st, 1863, he issued his weapon in the form of the Emancipation Proclamation as a formal issued wartime measure. Lincoln was not just the President of the United States, he was the Commander-in-Chief of the Army and the Navy of the United States under Article 2, Section 2 of the U.S. Constitution. Now, the South might not believe in that Constitution anymore, but the North certainly did, and it held sway in the Union States. The Emancipation Proclamation was really a pragmatic, three-pronged weapon on Lincoln's part. It was cleverly crafted. The first prong was that it liberated black chattel slaves in all of the Confederate slave states. It pulled the rug out from under the Confederacy because, as Alexander Stephens, the Vice President of the Confederate States, had proclaimed, slavery was their cornerstone. And now Lincoln was chipping away at that cornerstone with the Emancipation Proclamation. Another great aspect of it as a wartime measure is it included in the fine print that black males who were liberated by advancing Union armies were welcome to join them and become Union soldiers. It took 139,000 blacks ultimately from slave bondage into the armies of the Union, and they wore the blue just as their white counterparts did in battle. And that helped provide an edge. In fact, blacks would have 20% casualties as the war went on to whites 17%. That's how hard they were fighting to prove themselves as free men. Another aspect of this multi-pronged weapon of Lincoln's sword was that now the Union war goals were evolving. The war had initially, with Lincoln's earlier approval, been merely a war for reunification, bring the erring southern states back into the Union. That's all it was. But now it was a much broader vista. The armies of the Union were not conquering armies, they were liberating armies on a great humanitarian scale. This, in turn, affected overseas relations with Britain and France, particularly the former, the mighty British Empire, which was the most powerful military and political entity on Earth, upon which the sun never set. The British, in 1833, had already passed an ordinance of abolition for all slaves within their empire. If they sided now with the Confederacy, they would be siding with slavery. Lincoln's document was very, very, very clever in that respect. They couldn't go against the grain of going with slavery. In fact, Lincoln had gotten a letter from unemployed mill workers in Liverpool, England, saying they would rather be unemployed for want of southern cotton than manufacture any garment that was made from cotton picked by the hands of the poor slaves who Lincoln had now liberated as free. So the British Empire was more or less hamstrung at this point. They couldn't go with the Confederacy. The southern states themselves, along their coastlines, were being strangled by Lincoln's Anaconda, the great mighty naval blockade. The Confederacy did not have a navy, but Uncle Sam of the North had its webbed feet. 3,500 miles of Confederate coastline were closely patrolled by Union warships. Maybe one blockade runner from Europe in 12 was now getting through. That was how good the Union blockade was in maintaining that great mechanism to keep cannonballs, rifles, gunpowder, and all the other appliances of war, as they like to say back with their 19th century parlance, from European factories getting into Southern hands. In fact, the blockade was so effective that when dye ran out, gray dye, to use for the uniforms of the Confederate soldiers, they were getting it from Europe at first, but the blockade by 1863 had reduced it to almost nil. Now, the Confederate soldiers were not necessarily referred to as graycoats. They were butternut brown infantry because they had taken the walnut hulls from trees in the South, put them into boiling water vats, dipped their farm overalls in, took them out, hung them out to dry, and voila, they had butternut brown, or simply butternut. So this was the state of things for the Confederacy. Things looked very, very grim. On the mighty Father of Waters, Old Man River, the Mississippi River itself, one bastion remained, but it was under siege. General Ulysses Simpson, U.S. unconditional surrender Grant, in a vice-like grip, had his Yankee army around that city. If something wasn't done, and done quickly, the city would fall, and the Union would have control of the entire length of the Mississippi. It would split that mighty artery from north to south in two under Union control. That meant that Texas beef could not be shipped across the Mississippi at any point any longer to feed the Confederate armies. And all armies, in all eras of warfare, ancient, modern, and contemporary, always travel and fight on their stomachs. So this was the situation as it now stood. There was one really bright spot for the Confederacy, and that was in Virginia, under the bright leadership of Robert E. Lee and his first lieutenant, Stonewall Jackson. There had been two really tremendous victories. In December 1862, a huge Union army under Ambrose Burnside tried to sally forth across the Rappahannock River only 50 miles north of the Confederate capital at Richmond, Virginia. Its attacks were parried. They came head on. The Yankees lost in one day 12,000 men. The rebels only lost 4,000. At first they thought they had lost 5,000, but when they counted more closely, since it was near Christmas time, 1,000 voted with their feet to go home afterwards. But they quickly returned to Lee's army. So Lee was really in his cups militarily. In early 1863, the Union relieved Burnside after he did a disastrous mud march. He tried to go upstream and his army was encased in mud. The mud was so deep that the mules sank to their ears and all you could see were waggling mule ears above the mud. So Lincoln had to politely send Burnside west to a civilian command in Ohio. The new Union general was now Fighting Joe Hooker. He was a kind of northern version of Robert E. Lee, bedecked in a broad-brimmed cap, lots of gold braid on his shoulders, head to foot in a magnificent navy blue-colored uniform with black polished boots almost up to his knees, and replete on his white horse named, appropriately, Whitey. And he took many photos on the white horse. The only thing was Whitey's tail wouldn't stay still, and every time Whitey's tail was a blur in the camera. But nonetheless, Fighting Joe had a plan. He said, "My plan is so good that may God have mercy upon Robert E. Lee and his vaunted army of rebels called the Army of Northern Virginia, for I, Fighting Joe, shall have none. Fighting Joe crossed the Rappahannock way upstream. He came down in an arc. It looked like he was going to encompass Lee's whole army and bag it. He was marching, though, through an area of second-rate growth called the wilderness, a tangle of vines and thickets and thorns. Fighting Joe was approaching Lee's army, and suddenly he stopped. He took up a defensive stance. He wasn't sure of himself. Lee then took the initiative with his brilliant general, Stonewall Jackson. It was as if the two commanders were part of the same intelligence. Lee, the cerebellum of the brain, as it were, commanding the Army of Northern Virginia. Jackson, its cerebrum. The cerebellum saying, Jackson, how can we flank? And Jackson saying, yes, with my whole corps. Then will you take your corps, sir? Yes. Around the Yankee right flank, how many men will you need? The 30,000 in my whole corps. Then go do it, General Jackson. And on May the 2nd, 1863, a 6-mile march was commenced by Jackson. He went round Hooker's exposed right flank. Hooker got reports that there were some strange sightings of rebel infantry. He said, they must be retreating. Lee realizes the futility of standing in front of my great army of 130,000, whereas he only has 60,000 men. Jackson was poised on the flank. It was about 7 p.m. The Union were busy boiling coffee, cooking bacon, getting their hardtack wafers out to snack on. Suddenly they saw deer and squirrels and birds burst forth from the woods. They thought, well, this is really weird. It looks like dinner's coming to us. But then suddenly, behind that, came this eerie cry, the so-called rebel yell, yip, 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 yee. Thousands of butternut infantry burst from the woods. They rolled up the Union flank. It was the 11th Corps on the flank, Howard's Dutchmen, who were really Germans transplanted to America, who were going to fight for the Union cause. They rolled up the whole flank, backed Hooker's army to the back of the Rappahannock River. The sun was beginning to set. The moon came up. It was a brilliant gold moon, a full moon. Stonewall Jackson was one of these commanders who led. He was in the forefront of his men. If I could only find the Yankees' weak spot, we can continue to attack, pin them against the river, and defeat them in detail and win Southern independence right here. That was what Jackson's thinking was. He ventured forward. In the shadows, he and his staff were on horseback. Scared rebels thought, who is that? Who goes there, they said. It's General Jackson and his staff. No, that's a lie. It's a Yankee cavalry patrol. A burst of gunfire from a Confederate North Carolinian regiment, and down went Jackson and some members of his staff. Jackson's left arm was riddled with bullets. It had to be amputated later. He was out of the battle. Lee could not close upon Hooker's Army of the Potomac and defeat it in detail, but Hooker voluntarily retreated over the protests of his corps commanders because they could have turned the tables on Lee. They had the numbers, and Jackson's attack was more of a pinprick that had greater psychological value than actual tactical military value. Nonetheless, the victory was a Confederate one. It was a masterpiece for General Lee, but it had two flaws. One, Lee lost 13,000 men killed, wounded, or missing in the battle. His army was smaller. He had fewer recruits from the South. Hooker lost 17,000, but the Union had so many resources, including manpower, it could quickly make up for that loss. The greater loss was that of Stonewall Jackson himself. Lee sent Jackson a letter. General Jackson, I know you are trying to convalesce at Guinea Station, which was a few miles just east of the battlefield. I know that you have lost your left arm, but sir, if I lose you, I shall have lost my right arm, said Lee to Jackson. A day or so later, after that letter was delivered, church bells began to toll in Richmond. The civilians in the city, capital of the Confederate States of America, turned out en masse. They knew somehow, without even reading the papers or being told by officials, that the great Stonewall, their favorite general of all, was dead. Many thousands attended Jackson's funeral. Lee said, I do not know how to replace this man. I have many capable officers, but none who can intuitively understand my discretionary orders other than Stonewall Jackson himself. And this was true. These two victories, Fredericksburg and Chancellorsville, constituted high points for the Confederacy when there seemed to be doom and gloom all around. There was a high command meeting of the Confederacy as the Union sheltered itself behind the Rappahannock River. Jefferson Davis, president of the Confederacy, was there. He was a military man, and like Lee, they knew that these repulses of the larger Union Army, although they were terrific for Southern morale, were not dampening Union morale. The Union Army kept coming back and coming back and coming back for more. It was a larger army, and Lee recognized that after a period of time, it would be a siege. His army bottled up in Virginia. They would get a fighting commander on the Union side who wouldn't relent and use those superior numbers to his advantage. There were different ideas as to what the Confederacy should be doing as the summer of 1863 came on. One idea was advanced by Postmaster General of the Confederacy, John Reagan. He was the only member at the Select High Command meeting in Richmond, Virginia, who had lived west of the Mississippi River. He was a Texan, and he had also lived in Mississippi for a time, and he said to the small group, including Lee and Davis, that what we must do is attack Grant from the rear, detach 2 fresh infantry divisions from the Army of Northern Virginia, leave the remainder of the army to guard Richmond, take those 2 divisions and attack Grant from the rear. He said, Grant is one of these bulldog fighters. The only way to loosen his grip on Vicksburg is to attack him and defeat him, while Pemberton, who was a Confederate general inside the Vicksburg defenses, attacked from those defenses. These 2 divisions could attack Grant from the rear, coordinate, and defeat Grant in detail. That was his idea. Now, Longstreet was Lee's new first lieutenant. James Longstreet, he was a very stodgy general. Lee referred to Longstreet as my war horse. He was not a fancy general, but he believed in the arithmetic of war, and like Lee and Davis, he could see that the Union numbers would eventually grind the Confederacy into powder. So they had to do something really creative. But Longstreet's idea was to take those 2 divisions and, instead of going to Mississippi, drive up the Ohio River Valley from Kentucky. There was a lot of Copperhead sentiment in Ohio, a western state that had a lot of trade history with the Deep South. And they were disgruntled that there was a war going on. They wanted peace on any terms. It didn't matter to them if the Confederacy went free and kept slavery, as long as they could trade with them again. So Longstreet's idea was to drive into Ohio, win a big victory there, and weaken the Northern resolve, and maybe the North would make peace. But he was overruled by the first soldier of the Confederacy, Robert E. Lee. Lee was one of these people who had a sort of a guarded personality. It was really hard to get to know him personally. He had a sort of a monastery wall of dignity, and that was further cloaked in what he constantly called duty. You can never do more than your duty, Lee said, in this life. You should never wish to do less than your duty. Lee's idea was to protect Virginia while launching an invasion of the North. His idea was to march up the Shenandoah Valley, which was a natural valley corridor on the western flank of the state of Virginia, go into farm-rich Pennsylvania, replenish the Confederate Army. For the Confederate Army, unlike the Union Army, was a very poor army. It had to forage for its food. It had foraged so much in Virginia, there was hardly a wooden fence, post, or rail left standing, hardly a vacated barn standing, hardly a southern farm field left untouched by grazing rebel cavalry or by poaching rebel infantry. They poached their own farms, and they left them bare. They needed to go somewhere else to keep their army together as a whole, if for no other reason. But Lee saw an advantage, or so he thought. Go into Pennsylvania. We've been defeating the Union Army so regularly that we could defeat them on northern soil. If that happens, the soldiers in the ranks of the Federal Army, who are now showing some signs of being disgruntled, will throw down their rifled muskets and they'll go home. and we'll win the war de facto. Then we'll swoop down with our great army of Northern Virginia, which will do anything and march anywhere if only properly led, said Lee, and will hold Baltimore, Washington, and Philadelphia as hostage cities. And maybe even John Bull, the nickname for England, will come to his senses and see that that flimsy paper Emancipation Proclamation isn't worth the paper that it's printed on. And they'll recognize us as at last as a free, independent, and sovereign slave-holding nation, and we shall have won the war with their support, due to this victory that I envision in Pennsylvania. They took a vote, and it was something like 5-1, only the postmaster dissenting. So Lee had his way, and he took quick advantage of the time that was available to him. On June the 3rd, 1863, the armies were facing each other across that old river of war, the Rappahannock. Hooker's army was in place on the north bank, Lee's on the south bank. He kept the tents in place, he kept the campfires burning. He gradually shifted his foot marching masses, about 60,000 veteran infantry, westwards and then northwards up that corridor of the Shenandoah Valley on the west side of the Blue Ridge Mountains as a screen. His plan was starting perfectly. But the Union, too, was not to be easily fooled. They had a modern technology, the hydrogen balloon. They launched a couple of balloons on June the 4th and saw a strange thing. Yes, there were hundreds, if not thousands, of rebel tents and lean-tos down there on the ground. But there was no activity, no parade to call in the morning, no men milling about, cooking or gathering firewood, no sentries on guard. Very strange indeed. So Hooker went one step further. He had done something that no other Union commander in charge of the Army of the Potomac had done before. He took his 12,000 cavalry, which had been distributed amongst the infantry in penny packets, and he had formed it into a corps. Now, there had been an earlier general who had founded the Army in 1861 after the first defeat at Bull Run, or as the rebels called it, First Manassas, named General George B. McClellan. He was said to be a great organizer. He was really a troop trainer. In this way, Hooker had out-organized McClellan. He used his 12,000 men to splash across fords on the Rappahannock River on June the 9th, 1863, and they took the rebel cavalry by surprise under Jeb Stuart, the Southern Cavalier, who liked to have 3 ostrich plumes in his cap and was almost always attended by a group of fiddlers and a banjo player with his own personal pennant flag, which had gold braid on its fringes. The night before, Stuart had held a grand review for the ladies of Richmond as well as Robert E. Lee. And he had his 10,000 horsemen parade at a kind of a canter. The citizens of Richmond on a bluff looking down on this magnificent spectacle in the night spring air. Bands were playing, and then the band stopped, and the cavalry made charges, and with blank cannon ammunition and blank cavalry rifle ammunition for their stubby carbines, there were some shots fired, and they conducted a mock cavalry charge. It was also gallant and grand. This was the true chivalry of the South, which Stuart proclaimed they were all fighting for, and those jealous Yankees were trying to snuff out. But the next day was a different story. Stuart's men were resting after this grand review, and the Yankees came splashing across the river, and they barely got the cry out, "Yankees!" and their pickets or guards were shot down. The Yankees were coming, and they were coming in force. And not only did they have the 12,000 horsemen, they had 3,000 infantry back them to stiffen their advance. This was a serious reconnaissance in force by the Union. They nearly captured Stuart in his headquarters tent on Fleetwood Hill. Stuart managed just to get in his saddle in time. "Get our men mounted, boots and saddles for all regiments," he screamed out. Some of his commanders were so befuddled. One named Beverly Robertson, instead of riding toward the Yankees, got mixed up and rode in the opposite direction. It was a major humiliation. Stuart managed to get enough horsemen together. The Yankees were coming up the rise of what was called Fleetwood Hill. If he wasn't stopped, if the Union advance was not contained, they could smash the rebel cavalry and spoil Lee's advance right then and there. Stuart got his men to rally. Southern chivalry was not to be lost this day. There were charges and countercharges. It was the greatest cavalry battle in the Western Hemisphere ever fought before or since. Horsemen with sabers flashing and gleaming charged into each other. They went back and once, twice, maybe three times turned over backward somersaults. The Union lost about 900 cavalry troopers. Stuart lost about 500, but Stuart lost also his fabulous reputation. The Richmond newspaper said, "Stuart was caught off guard. This is our cavalier who has ridden around the Union Army twice and is supposed to be the intelligence for our great army of Northern Virginia. He's letting us down. Perhaps somebody else should take his place." Even one of the ladies who had been at the review wrote to Lee the next day and said, "This man is all bluff and bluster. General Lee, I consider very respectfully that you consider his replacement." But Lee decided to keep Stuart in charge. But Stuart's reputation was now sullied. So as the army went northward, it went across the Rappahannock River. This cavalry sortie by Hooker showed that the Confederates were on the move. He wasn't quite sure where. He started to pivot his army slowly around. He called to Washington via that mighty industrial revolutionary invention, the telegraph wire, for more reinforcements, complaining that he was outnumbered. The rebels might have 25,000 more men than I do. President Lincoln, I need more men. I also want the federal garrison in Harper's Ferry, which was a village at the very northern point of the Shenandoah Valley on the Potomac River. Lincoln's general-in-chief, Henry Wager Old Brains Halleck, who was really more of a paper shuffler and a bureaucrat than a field general, wired back that we couldn't spare the garrison to you, General Hooker. But Lincoln had a further message for Hooker. If Lee is indeed moving north, and his column stretches from Frederick, Maryland, all the way up toward the northern part of the Shenandoah Valley, which is like a 100-mile distance, surely you might strike him somewhere along that line. The animal, as Lincoln said, must be pretty slim somewhere in between. But no, Hooker proposed a counter strategy. Lee left Richmond uncovered. I shall go directly for Richmond. No, Lincoln retorted. Taking Richmond while perhaps allowing Lee to take Washington would be like swapping queens. Your army, he said, would be like a bull, half over the Rappahannock River, half over a fence, in other words, by way of analogy, unable to effectively gore from the front or kick from the rear the dogs that were tormenting it. Hooker was getting mighty tired of this. He decided to placate Lincoln. He had 7 Army Corps. He detached one of the 7 north of the Rappahannock River, went into Maryland. In central Maryland, it took up position at Fredericksburg. He also sent some cavalry northward. But one other thing he had the foresight to do was send a scouting party north. It went to the summit of what was called South Mountain. That is an extension of the Blue Ridge Range of mountains. They got up there, a Captain John Babcock, whose name is all but lost to history. This man did the great deed. He looked down with his party. They saw a lot of dust at first. They couldn't make out anything else. But then they saw marching butternut infantry moving north. It was a tail end of Ambrose Powell Hill's corps. Here was the definite proof that Lee's army was indeed marching forth into the hinterland of the North. Now Hooker was still screaming for more reinforcements, and he said in a final telegraph to General Halleck, who relayed the information to Lincoln, either give me that 10,000-man garrison at Harper's Ferry or accept my resignation. Well, he got a very quick answer. Resignation accepted. So the new commander was a goggle-eyed old snapping turtle who hated newspaper reporters, George Gordon Meade. Now, he was selected by Lincoln for a couple of reasons. One was he had no political ambitions. Hooker, for example, was linked to the radical Republicans who wanted instant abolition for all blacks in the United States. And Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation had left the black slaves in the border states of Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, and Delaware out of the equation because he didn't want those slaves to jump over to the Confederacy. They were still loyal Union states, or at least quasi-loyal states, but they were allowed to keep that slavery because it was a delicate political issue. So Meade, being apolitical, was a good choice. Meade was a very, very careful engineer. He was a steady, clear-headed general. And there was one other thing. Meade had been a long-time resident of Pennsylvania. We have Meade on the left and Lee on the right. And Meade was a very irascible general. If you were a soldier, you'd better be in spit polish for morning inspection when he came by. You'd better have your cap on, better have your hair combed, even if it was long. They wore beards and long hair, by the way, because that had been the trend in the British Army in 1854 on the Crimean Peninsula. Up to that time, the American armies in its previous war had all been clean-shaven, both officers and men. The British Army had only issued that regulation in their own army to grow beards because the Crimea was freezing cold. But they thought, wow, that's a neat trend. So men, both civilians and military, north as well as south, grew these big beards and mustaches and long sideburns and long hair. And Meade, you had better not be a pesky newspaper reporter. They would go into his camp. You're the new general of the Union Army as of June 28, 1863. What are your plans, General Meade? What's your idea for countering Lee? You've never been in an army before. How do you feel about that? And he would say, just please go away. Don't bother me. He would go into his tent. They might pull the tent drapes aside and say, General Meade, I have to get some answers to my paper. He would say, guards, apprehend this reporter. The reporter was then taken to an army mule, strapped over the back of the mule with his head dangling over the mule's hindquarters, and made to stay there for an hour or so. Then he was unstrapped, and the reporter left of his own accord. He didn't even have to be escorted out of the camp. But Meade did follow Lincoln's advice. Stay on the inside track. Keep your army between Lee's army and Washington. And so Meade called the rest of the army up from the Rappahannock River and into Fredericksburg, and then began to fan out his 7 infantry corps with his cavalry in the vanguard to feel out exactly where Lee's army was, because the animal was very slim in the long run. And Lee had his own logistical problems. His perfect plan was beginning to gradually become unraveled. Lee had retained Stuart in command. He had faith in him. He gave Stuart some discretionary orders. Stuart had escorted his columns up into the fabled Shenandoah Valley, which incidentally, Shenandoah is a word meaning beautiful daughter of the stars. In that beautiful, picturesque, rich farm valley, the breadbasket of the Confederacy, as it was sometimes aptly called, Lee had the cavalry with him. Then he said, Stuart, I will let you go on your own with 6,000, which is more than half of the cavalry, picked troopers, those that did the best at the Battle of Brandy Station, Virginia, on June 9th. And you may do all the damage to the rear areas of the Union Army, assuming it's approaching us. But above all, I want you to keep on the right flank of our advancing army for 2 purposes. One, to keep the Yankee cavalry from going through the mountain passes as we move northward in the Shenandoah Valley, so they can't find out what our exact disposition of our infantry corps is. And 2, so you can see where the spearheads of the Union Army is and send couriers back to me and tell me where they are and in what strength. And he said, whatever else you do, General Stuart, be circumspect in all of your movements and actions. Well, Stuart understood the letter of the orders, but in spirit, he was still hurting from Brandy Station. So what he did was, he did start on June 25th to swing along the skirts of the Blue Ridge Mountains. He started to fight Union cavalry. He kept them back. But on the morning of the 26th, he ran into Blue infantry. This was not something he expected. The Union infantry, although it was being made to do forced marches, realized the gravity of the situation. One more lost battle, especially on northern soil, which we better get there quickly to stabilize the situation, and we're going to lose the war. Well, Stuart had 2 choices. He could swing south, retrace his steps, which may not have entered his mind, and join Lee's army, but as it marched up that narrow Shenandoah Valley, his fine horsemen, including himself, would have to eat dust kicked up by the covered wagons that were in the supply train as well as Lee's infantry. So he thought, aha, I have a better idea. I'm going to ride around the entire Federal Army, which is now in central and western Maryland, I'm going to cut north and I'm going to go into Pennsylvania, and I am imagining that the advanced infantry will be on the south bank of the Susquehanna River, somewhere in the Harrisburg or York areas, and I will unite with them, and I'll kill two birds with one stone. So that's what he set out to do. He moved eastwards. Then he moved northwards. He crossed only 8 miles above Washington, D.C. on Rouser's Ford. He gets to 6,000 men across. He's barely across when he sees an incredible sight. He could not believe his eyes. A 150 wagon train of Yankee-covered wagons laden with everything. Oats for horses, bacon for men, wine, whiskey, and even perhaps that New England delight that the Yankees so much liked, oysters packed in ice. So he gave his men the order to charge. They swooped down on the train. Only 25 wagons escaped. They had 125 left. The problem was that Stuart was now marching at the pace of a mule train. Lee, on the meantime, was up there in the Shenandoah Valley saying, "This is mighty strange. Where is my cavalry? Does anyone know where my cavalry is? Where on earth is my cavalry?" Finally, on about June the 28th, the same day that Meade is appointed as commander of the Union Army, a spy is brought into Lee by Longstreet. Longstreet says, "Sir, in absence of Stuart's cavalry, and I imagine General Lee, he's just out there joyriding to save his lost reputation. This man named Harrison, and that's all he's known to history, has the exact whereabouts of the Yankee Army." Lee was skeptical, but he listened, and the more exacting Harrison's information was, the more Lee came to believe it. The Union Army was entirely across the Potomac River, marching toward southern Pennsylvania. And it had a new commander, Meade. And when Lee heard that Meade was the commander, he said, "I must be careful, for if I make any mistake in Meade's front, he will be in haste to take advantage of it." Lee began to recall his spearheads. A Confederate corps of his army under Ewell was just on the banks of the Susquehanna. Across that river was Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, not only the state capital, but the vital east-west rail link that connected the eastern northern states with the western went through Harrisburg. Take Harrisburg, you take that rail link, supplies, reinforcements, transportation, communication is cut off. Ewell was disgruntled, but he turned his column about and headed southwards. The army was congregating at Chambersburg in the next valley up in Pennsylvania. The troops were agape at the wonders. The farms were rich. They had thought that northern free labor only brought poverty and that only slave labor could bring wealth. And they saw that, in fact, the opposite was true. Virginia, which was barren, was in contrast to the rolling green hills and fields with corn and wheat abundantly in evidence. And many Confederates comfortably billeted themselves in farmhouses as they moved north. In fact, Longstreet had a sumptuous meal in one such farmhouse. The missus of the house came out and said, "Who is a general at this table?" And Longstreet rose and said, "I am, madam." She said, "Your men are outside pillaging. They're taking my hogs, my cows, my horses. We'll be left starving." And he said, "Ma'am, this kind of thing happens in Virginia all the time. It's sad, very sad, ma'am." And that was his response. That was the Southern view. The Yankees were going to be made to feel the hard hand of war that the Confederates had felt for 2 years in a row. So, at any rate, Lee's corps began to congregate at a little place called Cashtown. Lee's idea was, Cashtown was a gap, called Cashtown Gap. It was a village and the gap in South Mountain. Lee would maintain a defensive stance there. Let the Union Army come on, single file, and he would defeat it corps driven upon corps. It would be scattered into the four winds, and he would be victorious. Now, his army not only was poorly fed, it was poorly shod. About a quarter of the men were barefoot. Imagine marching 100 miles or so in bare feet, but they did it for Marse Robert, whom they practically worshipped. A column was sent out looking for shoes at a little village named Gettysburg, just to the southeast, 8 miles or so below this Cashtown Gap. And it was marching blind. It was an entire infantry division under Henry Heth of Ambrose Powell Hill's corps. The date was July 1st, 1863. Now, Confederate troops had gone through a few days before, and scuttlebutt usually travels quickly in an army. There were no shoes in Gettysburg. There was no shoe factory, no shoe shops, and if there were cobblers, they had gone in hiding at the approach of the rebel infantry. So anyway, they approached the town, and there was a little ridge to the northwest, about a half mile beyond Gettysburg, the village, which had a population of 2,500, including 300 free northern blacks. And a volley of rifle fire greeted them. Actually, it was small arms carbine fire. It was about 1,500 dismounted Yankee cavalry troopers. And these were the first shots of the Battle of Gettysburg on the morning of July 1st, 1863. So Heath thought, could it just be a detachment? Well, he started to fire back. And soon more Confederate troops and more Union troops were drawn to the sounds of the guns. Meade was not with his vanguard. He had been near the state line in northern Maryland at a place called Pipe Creek. That was pretty much equidistant from Gettysburg and Washington, D.C. His idea was to fortify the Pipe Creek line and let Lee's army dash itself upon the defenses of Pipe Creek. But instead, Gettysburg was important because it was a road nexus. It had about 10 intersecting roads. One road went down toward Baltimore and Washington. Another road went north toward Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Another road went westwards. Another road went to Hanover, Pennsylvania. Another road went to Chambersburg. Another road went to Emmitsburg, Maryland. It was indeed a spider web of roads, and symbolically, like a spider web, it began to ensnare the armies which were feeling for each other, especially Lee's army, which was marching blind without the benefit of Stuart's cavalry. So the first day, a lot of fighting began to take shape. The Confederates had the advantage because they had 6,000 men in Heth's division. They could actually extend beyond the Union detachment. They began to push it back. Union reinforcements came up. A General John Reynolds, commanding the 1st Corps, came up. His corps was enveloped. Reynolds was killed, but not before he had surveyed the ground and sent a message back to Meade saying, abandon the idea of fighting on Pipe Creek. Bring the army up to Gettysburg. There are some heights just south of the town that would be ideal as a defensive place to fight a great battle against Lee in Pennsylvania. Lee came up on the other end of the spectrum, and he looked at the battlefield and said, I must pull my men back. I gave orders not to bring on a general engagement. Now, years later, Henry Heth, who commanded Lee's spearhead into Gettysburg, claimed he was looking for shoes, but he also said, parenthetically, that he and his boys were looking for a brawl with those darn Yankees. So the latter may have been more true than the former, which might just be a tall tale and part of Gettysburg's folklore. But then, suddenly, part of Ewell's men, Ewell being the commander who had been recalled from the south bank of the Susquehanna River, came down from the north. They enveloped the Union infantry, and they were rolling them up very nicely. In fact, the German troops who had fled at Chancellorsville a couple of months before were now fleeing at Gettysburg. And this reinforced, by the way, the opinion of both Northerners and Southerners that Germans, above all, made the poorest combat troops, and that therefore Germany in Central Europe, otherwise known as Prussia, had no future as a great military and political power. So that was a concept in mid-19th century America. So Lee thought, you know, I'll fight the battle here at Gettysburg after all. We're winning it. Longstreet rode up, and Longstreet said, General Lee, I think you're in a perfect position to go around the Union's flank and try to outflank them. Let's get our army between the Union Army and Gettysburg. I had been at Fredericksburg past December. Let's fight another Fredericksburg in Pennsylvania. We surely can win that way. And Lee said, no. Look, there's Cemetery Hill just south of town. We've got the town now. As his infantry filed through the narrow streets of Gettysburg, two of which were symbolically named Washington Street and Baltimore Street. And he said, we take that hill as dusk was falling, and we've got the position. I shall order General Ewell to attack if practicable. But as Shakespeare might have said, there was a rub. Ewell had inherited Stonewall Jackson's old 2nd Corps. But Ewell was no Jackson. He had a peg leg. He had gotten married, and he had been converted to religion. It had taken away his fighting edge, apparently. So, instead of attacking Cemetery Hill, he said, no, my troops are too tired out. We'll just stay just briefly south of town, and we'll see how things develop on the morrow. It disappointed Lee, but Lee was one of these commanders who didn't want to have tight rein on his generals in battle. Lee's philosophy was, I come up with a battle plan. I issue discretionary orders. Hopefully the troops are put into place, and then the rest is in God's hands. So that was Lee's philosophy. And he carried it out here too at Gettysburg, just as he did in Virginia. Now, as the sun began to set, the Union Army came up. More infantry, more corps. They occupied the topography around Gettysburg to its south. And if you look, Gettysburg, the blue being the Union, by the way, the red being Lee's army or the Confederate. You've got the town of Gettysburg up here. On the first day, Heth's men had come this way and encountered Buford's cavalry on a ridge up in this area and had driven them back down to here. Also, Ewell's men had come down from the north. But the defensive advantage of Gettysburg is, one, it was on interior lines. If you look at the blue arch-shaped configuration on this slide map, it's a convex defensive line. If they're attacked here, they can shift troops from here. If they're attacked down here, they can shift troops from the northern part. Indeed, the line looked like a gigantic upside-down fishhook on the map. There was a conical eminence, two of them actually, big round top down here, and little round top here, and then a long shank of the fishhook that went up to a hill called Cemetery Hill because the town's evergreen cemetery was there. There was another hill, that was the barb of the hook, called Culp's Hill. Ironically, the Culp boy, Wesley Culp, was fighting in the Confederate Army. His family had disowned him when he went with the Southerners, and eventually he would be attacking that hill. Now, Lee had the exterior lines of battle. He had what was called Seminary Ridge because up in this area there was a Lutheran seminary, and it had a tall tower with a cupola, and you could go up there and look with your binoculars and survey the whole battlefield. It was an excellent advantage. So Lee had about close to 55 to 65,000 men in place by day 2 of the 3-day battle. Meade already had close to 55,000 in place. Dawn of the next day, Lee issued orders to Longstreet, his chief lieutenant, that down here in the southern portion of his battle line, he would go across and attack the blue line on Cemetery Ridge. And he'd roll it up, and Ewell's men would then, after they heard the sound of Longstreet's cannon, attack from the north, and they would basket the retreating, rolled up southern flank of the Union Army. The problem was Longstreet disagreed. He had thought all along that when Lee's army got into Pennsylvania, which he was sure it would, and it did, that they would fight a tactical defensive battle, not a tactical offensive battle. The problem was this: Lee's smaller army was covering now a frontage of about 6 miles. Meade's larger army was taking up a frontage of only 4 miles. By the time both armies were fully up, by the end of the second day that is, Meade would have about 118 cannon per lineal mile. Lee would only have 54 cannon per lineal mile. Meade would have 16 infantry soldiers per lineal mile. Lee would only have 7 infantry soldiers per lineal mile. But as Longstreet said, Lee's blood was up. When the hunt was up, he was ready to fight at the enemy and to attack him like a terrier attacking a St. Bernard, perhaps. So at any rate, Longstreet was ordered to go across directly. He had to get his men in order, though. Longstreet's philosophy was, I never go into battle with one boot on, which meant that he did a nifty countermarch behind Seminary Ridge. But as he marched, he thought maybe the Union might have seen him. He went across a height called Ayers Ridge. He decided to countermarch and go back and take a route closer to Seminary Ridge. By the time he got his men in position, an attack he was supposed to have carried out at 9 a.m., it was now 4 p.m., and the men were thirsty. Someone got the idea, let's collect the canteens. There are a lot of streams. You've got creeks back here, and at Willoughby's Run and at some of these other creeks, we're going to fill up our freshwater canteens. By then, however, Longstreet was ready to go over to the attack. and the attack was to be conducted in echelons. The only thing was, an unwarranted maneuver on the part of the Union side made Lee's plan obsolete. There's a place called the Peach Orchard right here at this red dot. There was a Union Corps commander named Dan Sickles, an impetuous fellow who had in prior years fought a duel with an imaginary philanderer who was engaging with his wife. Whether or not that part is true, he committed murder, but he got off on the charge of temporary insanity. Supposedly the first such case, by the way, in the United States, and the person who conducted the court case was Edwin McMaster Stanton, who is now coincidentally Lincoln's Secretary of War. So at any rate, Dan Sickles felt the Peach Orchard, because it was higher than South Cemetery Ridge, was the place to defend. He'd plant artillery and riflemen up there, and he could enfilade, or that is, fire upon the rebel lines at angles and cause a great deal of casualties and maybe win the battle that way. He did not get orders from General Meade to do this maneuver. But nonetheless, he marched his 10,000 men forward. Now, as an afterthought, he thought, well, you know, we're up here now. Maybe I should ask General Meade if my idea was a good one after all. So he sent a courier, and Meade rode out. He rode back to meet Meade. And as the two met, he said, you know, General Meade, I think this is a good idea. What do you think? He said, this is a terrible mistake, General Sickles. But I see that it is too late to send the men back now. And presently, as he spoke, which was about 4:30 in the afternoon, the rumble of rebel cannon was apparent. And it was Longstreet's artillery sounding or heralding forth the charge of the blood-curdling rebel yell. And on three sides of what was called Sickles' salient, the rebels attacked and overran Sickles' men. Now, Sickles had made a very grievous mistake. And the reason was not just exposing his men to being massacred out here at the Peach Orchard, but picture this whole south end of Cemetery Ridge clear down to Little Round Top with no Yankee soldiers on it. The victorious rebels were now starting to advance across the field. They were given orders to roll up the flank, but one of their commanders, Evander Law of Hood's division, decided to go on top of this big eminence down here called Little Round Top. It was 300 feet high. It was the highest eminence on the whole battlefield. He got up to the top. His men were thirsty. They were tired, but he said, all we need now is a party of axemen, because there were woods on the top. We'll cut a couple of fire lanes, manhandle 2 or 3 cannon up here, and we can enfilade the entire Union defense, anywhere from Little Round Top, easily, and we'll destroy their defensive line and win the battle. But no sooner had his men gotten to the top of Big Round Top, he gets an order from a courier that General Law presents his compliments, but now he wants you to vacate Big Round Top, and he wants you to go north via the saddle that connects it with Little Round Top and take that height as well. Now, all that was on Little Round Top was a Union wigwag crew with the wigwag flags, frantically signaling for reinforcements. Who knows? They had an engineer with them, Governor K. Warren. He was not a combat officer in the Federal Army of the Potomac, but he saw the rebels starting to advance. And he thought, my God, I've got to do something. He looked around from the top of Little Round Top, which is about, let's say, 150 or 160 feet above the valley floor. He saw behind it a brigade of Union infantry. On his own recognizance, he went down. It was led by Strong Vincent, a very stolid Union commander. And he said, well, by whose orders? Are you ordering us up to defend this height called Little Round Top? And he said, by my own, sir. I will take full responsibility. So he complied, and his brigade got up to the peak of Little Round Top just as the rebels were racing up the slope. They had just enough time to fire their muskets down, but they stopped the charge. The rebels regrouped. Little Round Top did not have woods, but it had lots of boulders on it. Both sides engaged to a hand-to-hand melee amidst these boulders. 5 times the rebels attacked. 5 times the Union repelled them. At the extreme left flank of the Union Army on the second day, July 2nd, there was a Maine regiment led by Joshua Chamberlain, who was a professor at Maine College, at Bowdoin College in the state of Maine. He was a philosophy professor, and he was also skilled in oratory, and he knew several foreign languages, including, of all things, Arabic. So he was what would have been called a very well-rounded man for the 19th century. He decided his men out of ammunition. What happens if the rebels make another attack? We didn't bring enough spare ammo in our ammo pouches up with this. He suddenly said, fix bayonets, do a right wheel, and charge. And his men took up the yell. And with that, about 400 Maine infantrymen charged down the slope of Little Round Top. There were Texans and Alabamians, Oates, veteran 15th Alabama, trying to struggle up for perhaps a sixth charge. He not only met the Alabama boys, but they turned tail. And he captured several hundred of them, and that helped to end the attempt at Little Round Top. There was another Union commander, a Patrick O'Rourke. He had the volunteer 140th New York on sort of the northeast side of Little Round Top. It was a good thing he did because Confederate infantry were lapping around there, and he stopped them cold. So these two double actions at Little Round Top saved that eminence from Confederate control, but the crisis was still not over. More Confederate units were conducting timed attacks called echelon attacks. Attack here, a half hour later attack here, and at some point there'll be a weak point. That was what they were hoping to do, and then the rest would join in and exploit a breakthrough. There were two Confederate brigades, Wilcox's brigade and Lang's brigade, and they were coming through the southern part of the valley between Seminary Ridge and Cemetery Ridge. It was about 7 p.m. There was no Union soldier save one on top of the south half of vacated Cemetery Ridge that Sickles had recklessly abandoned. This was John Hancock, a general in the Federal Army, sometimes called Hancock the Superb because he was a tough, seasoned combat general. He was looking frantically for reinforcements to the left, to the right, behind him. He saw a ragged regiment coming down the north spine of Cemetery Ridge. He said, "Colonel, do you see those Confederates advancing across the valley floor?" And the colonel named Colonel William Colville said, "Well, yes, sir, General Hancock, I do." "Do you recognize some of those colors?" "Yes, I recognize Alabama colors. I see some Florida colors. I see some colors of the state of Georgia." He said, "Then go take them." There were approximately 3,000 Johnnies coming across the valley. The regiment that was to do the attack, the 1st Minnesota of the 1st Division of the 1st Army of the First Republic, had 272 officers and men. They charged anyway. The whole fate of the Union was resting on their shoulders, or so they thought. There was a little run called Plum Run, a little creek. The rebels were advancing toward one side of it, these Minnesotans advancing on the other side. They charged with bayonet. They let loose a volley of fire. The Confederates were so startled that they stopped in their tracks. There was a firefight. Eventually, the 1st Minnesota was overwhelmed and only 47 men made it back to the south part of Cemetery Ridge alive. But by then, Hancock had gotten more reinforcements up. There was a 5th Infantry Corps that was marching up the road, and he got several of their divisions in line, and the Southerners got only to the foot of South Cemetery Ridge. So again, the battle was saved. But another crisis again on the second day. About at the center of Cemetery Ridge, there was an entire brigade of 1,500 Georgia infantry. There was nobody there. They actually gained the ridge at about 7:30. Their commander looked to his left. He looked to his right and could not see reinforcements coming. He was overwhelmed. The reinforcement general, Dorsey Pender, and his Virginians were immobile because Pender had been killed by a shell fragment. So with that, the second day of the battle climaxed. There was fighting around Cemetery Hill and Culp's Hill, but the Union side held on. Now, the third day of the battle, Lee's blood still up. He decided to go on an all-out wager against the center of Cemetery Ridge. He would conduct it with his all-Virginia division under George E. Pickett that had not fought in the battle. He also would take 2 divisions from A.P. Hill's corps. He put Longstreet in charge. Longstreet wailed that it could not succeed. The Yankees had been reinforced on the previous day, and now on July 3rd, no 15,000 men, ever arrayed for battle, Longstreet declared, could ever break that Yankee line yonder. But Lee said, no, go forward. There was a huge Confederate artillery barrage, 146 cannon sounded off. But they did nothing. It was the greatest pyrotechnics of the year, but the biggest humbug of the season. Their fuses on their shells had been made in Atlanta, Georgia. The fuses were timed too long. By the time they exploded, they had flown over the Yankee line. There was nothing but empty field that they were landing on and exploding. Pickett, nonetheless, asked for Longstreet. Sir, the barrage has ended. It's about 3:30 p.m. Hadn't I better go forward, sir? Longstreet said nothing. He grasped Pickett's hand in both of his, tears coming down Longstreet's face and into his big bushy beard. And he nodded silently. And so, in perfect cadence, no one should have missed it for the world, 11,000 Confederates, not making their usual ragged charge, stepped forward, step by step, flags dressed, lines in perfect formation. It looked invincible. It was not. The Union artillery, thought to be silenced, had only stopped to cool the barrels of their cannons. 80 guns from Cemetery Ridge and other points opened up. They shot big holes in the rebel lines like you could drive a horse and carriage through. The lines closed gaps silently. They got halfway across at the Emmitsburg Road. They climbed the fences. Now Yankee rifle fire was hitting them. And it seemed like a locust of balls. The Union was putting packets or tins of canister in the barrels of their cannon and were now firing them as if they were giant shotguns, firing iron grape. They were shredding the Confederate lines. The wings of the Confederate lines wilted and withered away. Now, what had been a linear attack formation became an assault column. It was a case of the irresistible force versus the immovable object. The Confederates got to a little stone wall by a little clump of trees, which was their rallying point of concentration. At Cemetery Ridge, 3/4 of a mile across, it's amazing that any of them made it. At the ridge, they let loose a volley. Then they hesitated. Should they advance over the stone wall? There were so many Yankees there. There was a commander in the assault. It had been named Pickett's Charge, but Pickett hid in a farmhouse halfway across, which afterwards he claimed was an observation point. Nonetheless, Lewis Armistead led not only Virginians, but North Carolinians, Tennesseans, and other states over the stone wall. About 200 to 300 brave soldiers followed him. The Union riddled them. Some threw down their arms and surrendered. The Union said, "Come over to this side of the Lord." And they did. And the Union, too, had showed signs of wavering. Some of them felt a slapping on their back. Was it a hailstorm? No, it was a mounted officer hitting them with the flat of his sword to get moving. Another group of Union soldiers was going to fall back. They actually turned around. They were Massachusetts boys. They had had enough of battle. There was another line facing them. They thought, this isn't the enemy, it's our own fellow Unionists. It was a line of what was called file closers. Had George Orwell been alive then, he would have been duly proud. File closers were the battle police. If you started to run away, they had orders to shoot you dead. But they needed the men just down to repel so-called Pickett's charge, even though Pickett wasn't in charge. So the file closers locked arms, and they kept them from running back, and they held their ground. In about 20 minutes, the so-called Pickett's charge was all over. The men, those who could survive, which is only 3,000 out of about 12,500 for some supports had been sent up, came back to Lee's lines. Lee rode out in person to meet them. "Men, the blame is all mine. This is all my fault." He was on a splendid horse, Traveler, that great dappled horse. And he said, "Everything will come right in the end. Just now, though, all good men must rally. We can not always expect to gain victories." There were shells exploding around Lee. He was at his finest moment at that point in time. It was as most humanly interpersonal as he ever reacted with the men in his army. But the Battle of Gettysburg was over. He had lost 28,000 irreplaceable men, more than a third of his army. The next day, Meade thought about counterattacking. He thought, no, we'll ruin ourselves just as Lee did on July the 3rd. We won't do it. Lee made a leisurely retreat all the way back across the Potomac River into Virginia. And this is Pickett's charge, which has been done a zillion times. These are captured Confederate soldiers wearing butternut, not a one in gray. And this is the route, let's go back one, of Lee's retreat. He was unmolested all the way to Williamsport. The rain came down. It was said it was caused by the clouds of gun smoke and cannon smoke from the battle. Who knows? The wagon train of wounded was 17 miles long. That would be like from here to Shelville. And Lee left 4,000 wounded to the Unionists to take care of in Gettysburg itself. That was how haphazard his retreat was. But on the retreat, Stuart held off marauding Union cavalry. Commanders like General Custer or Kilpatrick, who was nicknamed Kill Cavalry, pursued, but Stuart beat them off in sad, heroic rallies. Meade decided by July the 14th, or rather 13th, to attack Lee's army, which was still getting over some makeshift bridges over the Potomac. And he wired Lincoln, "I shall attack unless something intervenes." And of course Lincoln said, "Something will intervene." And sure enough, he was so slow that by the time he closed on the north bank of the Potomac, Lee's army was pretty much wholly across. The war would drag on. Lee wrote a letter scolding Meade. Meade wrote a letter back saying, "But we have ridded our precious soil of Pennsylvania from every vestige of the invader." Lincoln wrung his hands in despair. "When will our generals understand that the whole soil is our country?" That was Lincoln's analysis. And this is sort of a doting Lincoln, because he realized that the enemy army was the true objective point and had to be destroyed for the Union to be victorious. Meade had it in the hollow of his hands and would not close them. There was a cemetery constructed almost right after the battle, and the graves were equally set so that no one Union stayed. It was just for Union soldiers, and it was called the Soldiers' Cemetery. It wasn't nationalized until 1872. So this marvelous cemetery should be dedicated. And they thought, who's the greatest speaker in the whole history of the United States that's still alive? Why, everyone said with one voice, of course it is Edward Everett. And this was a man who was America's first PhD, although he earned it in Germany, but still, he was a man who could point out to intelligent foreigners that other lowlife of the nation, President Lincoln, as the newspapers sometimes said. So Everett came to Gettysburg. He gave a 2-hour per oration. It wasn't delivered till November 19th, 1863, because he had to have the time to research and write it. He recounted the whole battle and compared it to Greek battles of ancient times. So his was a wide tableau. He brought up two very important points: that Southern secession was a sophistry, since they claimed they wanted to be left alone, but what had they been doing up in Pennsylvania? And the other thing was that the women of Gettysburg during the battle nursed both Union and Confederate soldiers, and he predicted that woman's place in society in America and abroad was going to expand because of this. That women were making as valuable a contribution as bread earners, namely the men. Now, as an afterthought, Governor Andrew Curtin invited Honest Abe up. He thought, maybe we should have, what's his name? Lincoln, President Lincoln, that's it. And he'd give a little speech after the great addresses given by Everett. So Lincoln got up there on this podium and he said, well, 77 years ago. He was harking back to the Declaration of Independence, all men are created equal. He was trying to spoon feed the public. He didn't use Union or Confederate. He didn't use friend or enemy. He went on to say that this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, meaning the Emancipation Proclamation, and that we honor these dead here who did not die in vain. He meant both Union and Confederate dead. When he toured the battlefield, a Union reporter said, President Lincoln, think of the great soldiers who defended these heights at Cemetery Ridge. And he said, yes, but also think of the great and brave soldiers who assailed these heights. He was trying to get across to Americans that that government of, by, and for the people was for everyone, north, south, east, west, black, red, white, brown, and that it shall not perish from the earth. Indeed, it should not only perish from that part of the earth known as the United States of America, but it should spread around the entire planet for all time, forever, for equality and freedom for everyone. So that concludes my Gettysburg talk.
Well, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Enthusiastic. I'm sure you have a few questions.
Yes.
And we'll